In 2019, a tragedy struck in an Alabama prison. Coral Sims, an inmate at Donaldson Correctional Facility, died of heat stroke. He was working in a scorching laundry room with no breaks and not enough water. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The whole picture is so disturbing to absorb. But why and how is this happening? Why are inmates working in such brutal conditions in 2024? Who's making millions while they suffer? And how has this form of modern-day slavery managed to stay hidden in plain sight? It all started back in 1861, when the Civil War shook America. After the war, Alabama, like many southern states, faced a dilemma. They had lost their workforce with the abolition of slavery. And the best possible solution they found was a convict leasing system. This was a way to replace slave labor with inmates. Blacks were arrested and imprisoned for bogus crimes and then leased to mines, plantations, and railroads. It was tough, dangerous work, and it was just another form of slavery under a different name. Fast forward to today, and you'll see the shadows of this system still lingering in Alabama's prisons. Inmates work for next to nothing. Some don't get paid at all. Those who do earn between 25 cents and 75 cents an hour. It's not just unfair, it's exploitation. Also, the work isn't just poorly paid, it's dangerous too. Picture this: unsafe conditions where injuries are common and safety is not a priority. It's like the old days on the plantations, but now it's in modern prisons. In 2019, the Department of Justice even called out Alabama for these conditions. Add to this the COVID-19 pandemic, during which inmates were making masks and sanitizer. But how is this allowed to keep happening in the good old US of A? Well, as it turns out, the law has a loophole. The 13th Amendment, while it ended slavery, still allows forced labor as a punishment for crimes. This means inmates fighting against unfair labor have a tough battle. Laws like the Prison Litigation Reform Act make it even harder for them to stand up for their own rights. In 2017, a major lawsuit hit Alabama. The state, along with some private companies, was accused of profiting from this forced labor. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about basic human rights, challenging a system that seemed to ignore them. Inmates supported by labor unions and rights groups stood up, saying, "Enough is enough." They argued that this whole setup broke anti-human trafficking laws and the Constitution itself. But nothing happened, because the truth is that the entire system is part of a massive profit machine with millions made on the backs of inmates. There are a lot of big companies involved in this. Take Ashley Furniture, for example. This furniture giant, with billions in annual revenue, sources furniture from places like Elmore Correctional Facility. Here, inmates earn as little as 28 cents per hour. The company faced a lawsuit in 2019 accused of profiting from forced labor and inhumane conditions. And then there's Under Armour. Yes, the sportswear behemoth. They used to get apparel from prisons like Bullock County Jail, where inmates made 14 cents an hour sewing jackets. They cut ties with Alabama prisons after a documentary exposed the dreadful conditions. Telephone services in prisons are another cash cow. Companies like Global Tel-Link charge exorbitant rates for inmate calls. In Alabama, a 15-minute call can cost $15, a heavy burden for inmates' families. This practice faced lawsuits for being predatory and exploitative. Other major players include Union Furniture Industries and Unicor Corporation. They make millions from inmate labor, producing furniture and products like military boots. Yet very little, if any, of these profits go back into helping the inmates. For instance, Unicor's profits exceed $500 million annually, but a total of zero is reinvested into rehabilitation. To add, not one penny of the huge profits that these companies make go into bettering the prisons that these inmates live in. They still reside in overcrowded cells, lack health care, and receive almost no mental health support. While companies profit, inmates face moldy, vermin-infested cells and inadequate medical care. Educational and rehabilitation programs are few and far between. Then where does all the money go? Mostly it's spent on building more prisons, increasing staff salaries and administrative costs. Very little is invested into rehabilitating the inmates. It's a cycle that keeps the prisons full and the profits rolling in. But it's not just about the corporations and prisons in this game. There's a whole hidden network. Lobbyists push to keep these labor contracts going. Financial institutions invest in prison projects drawn by the guaranteed profits from inmate labor. This web of economic interest keeps the system in place, regardless of the human cost. And it's not just an Alabama issue. Across the U.S., over 800,000 inmates are part of this prison labor system. They're making products for industries ranging from furniture to call centers. Companies like IBM, AT&T, and even Victoria's Secret have been linked to prison labor. The annual revenue is a staggering $11.6 billion. The law, which is there to give justice to people, is also focused more on filling the prisons. The justice system is creating a pipeline that sends marginalized communities, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, to prison. Often these imprisonments are for extended periods, even for minor offenses. Now, let's explore how this pipeline works and its deep-rooted impact. In Alabama, the racial disparity in incarceration rates is alarming. African Americans, who make up 27% of the state's population, represent over 70% of its prison population. They face an incarceration rate of 1,414 per 100,000 Black residents, starkly higher than the 202 per 100,000 rate for white residents. Hispanics, though a smaller demographic, also face disproportionate incarceration, with a rate of 405 per 100,000. This is all happening because of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. These laws set fixed sentences for certain crimes. But in Alabama, being caught with a small amount of certain drugs can land you in prison for years. This has hit young people from marginalized communities hard, leading to long sentences for non-violent offenses. Take Christopher Williams' case in 2014. He got a mandatory 25-year sentence for possessing 2 ounces of marijuana in Alabama. Then there's Crystal Harris, who spent 15 years in prison for selling $28 worth of crack cocaine. These cases are shocking, but not unique. They represent many who are trapped by mandatory minimums, especially for non-violent crimes. The war on drugs has only made things worse. It started in the 1970s and has disproportionately targeted minorities for drug offenses. This led to racial profiling and harsher sentences for Black and Hispanic individuals compared to their white counterparts who were found guilty of similar crime. Private prisons add another layer to this. These for-profit institutions have a financial incentive to keep their beds filled. They've been accused of lobbying, successfully might we add, for harsher sentencing laws to increase incarceration rates. This raises serious concerns about their influence on justice. And don't get us started on the conditions inside the private and other prisons. Physical abuse in these prisons is shockingly common. In 2022, a federal judge condemned the conditions at Donaldson Correctional Facility as cruel and unusual punishment. Inmates like James Fowler and William Thomas suffered severe injuries at the hands of guards. Fowler sustained broken ribs and internal bleeding after a beating, while Thomas was tasered for refusing to clean a toilet, causing nerve damage and trauma. Medical neglect is another grim chapter. Anthony Lewis, a diabetic inmate at Limestone Correctional Facility, died after being denied treatment. Julia Green, suffering from ovarian cancer at Tutwiler Prison, had to endure months of pain before getting surgery. These cases are just the tip of the iceberg. Sexual abuse and harassment are rampant too. At Tutwiler Prison, an investigation in 2023 found guards forcing inmates to perform sexual acts. This abuse isn't isolated. Between 2014 and 2019, there were 147 complaints of sexual abuse in state prisons. Punishments for minor infractions are excessively harsh. In St. Clair's Correctional Facility, possessing unauthorized food can land you in solitary confinement for 30 days. In Bullock County Jail, talking back to an officer might result in weeks in a tiny, lightless cell. As one can imagine, the psychological impact of these conditions is devastating. A 2022 study found that over 60% of Alabama inmates suffer from depression and anxiety. Inmates like John Williams and Sarah Miller speak of the trauma and anxiety they face daily due to violence and the threat of abuse. Inmates are also exposed to hazardous materials without proper protection. In 2020, an investigation revealed inmates at Holman Correctional Facility working in a moldy laundry facility without masks or gloves. At Julia Tutwiler Prison, inmates handle harsh chemicals, leading to skin and respiratory problems. Solitary confinement, a brutal form of punishment, is widely used in Alabama. The ACLU reported in 2019 that Alabama had one of the highest rates of solitary confinement in the U.S. William Edwards spent 23 years in solitary at Donaldson Correctional Facility, an experience he described as torture. Solitary is often used as a punishment for labor disputes, worsening the mental health of inmates already suffering from the harsh prison conditions. And if we talk about reforms, then it would be like fighting a tough battle against a giant. Big companies like Ashley Furniture and Under Armour, along with private prison industries, are fighting hard to keep things as they are. They make a lot of money from cheap prison labor, so they use their power to slow down any changes that could hurt their profits. Changing the laws is really hard in this system where money talks louder than justice. But there's still hope. History has shown us that with enough determination, big changes can happen. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott or the Fair Labor Standards Act. These were huge wins against unfair systems, and they remind us that we can make a difference. Even now, some states are making progress. Places like Colorado and Maryland are raising inmate wages and cutting ties with private companies. These steps show that change is possible. The world is watching too. International groups are calling out the bad conditions in Alabama's prisons, and their pressure could push for better laws. It won't be easy, but if we use history as an indicator, we know that change is always possible.